Hello, and thanks for joining me. My name is AJ Me. I am a business intelligence technical specialist for Microsoft based out of the Mid-Atlantic here in the US. And I wanted to go over some things that I learned about our new Power BI offering. As you may or may not know, on July 8th, last week as of this recording, July 8th of 2013, at our Worldwide Partner Conference, we announced the upcoming availability of a net new offering of ours called Power BI, and it consists of some things we've had on the market for a while, namely Power Pivot and Power Query, along with some things that have been in pre-release state, Data Explorer and GeoFlow, and those two technologies have been renamed to Power Query and Power Map, respectively. And as part of the Power BI offering, there's also some cool stuff around natural language query, obviously being able to host this in the cloud, the availability of a mobile app for Windows and iOS devices. Where I wanted to spend some time today was on this Power Query and Power Map stuff in in Power BI. In particular, this Power Query thing where I've got the ribbon up at the moment. It kind of puzzled me when this thing first came out. But my initial reaction was, well, why does this thing exist outside of Power Pivot? Why not impart some of the cool things that you can do in Power Query, namely sort of the availability of some non-standard or non-traditional data sources, such as Facebook feeds, being able to pull data in from Hadoop, and some non-standard data connections, non-standard being some things that in our terminology, things that Power Pivot has not recognized as native data sources in the past. And so what I wanted to do is kind of get beyond that and kind of explore some use cases where I think Power Query could be an excellent fit for some things that I try to do. And one of my colleagues kind of positioned Power Query as like the ETL of self-service business intelligence, and that theme has really stuck with me. And so I wanted to walk you through a couple of examples of some non-business related, some things that get into my own interest areas of interest, and show you how you can apply this Power Query strategically as part of your self-service BI initiatives. So in my case, what I wanted to do is start with some, I guess, semi-structured data. So here on the screen now, you're going to see a my Internet Explorer pointing to Craigslist, and one of my hobbies, it's a little bit more than a hobby, is music, and I tend to peruse the musical instruments for sale list rather frequently. It's almost borderline an addiction for me. And so if you're of the musical type, you tend to look here and say, well, what's net new that's out there? It hasn't been posted in a while. What's something that's fairly vintage? What's fairly unique? What's fairly close to me? And those are the kinds of things that I look for when I'm scrolling through a list like this. Now, Craigslist doesn't really supply a database that we can tap into. They don't even really supply an API. What they do supply, I guess, at a basic level, is a way for us to turn this into an RSS feed. So we can do a quick alteration of the URL that points at the musical instruments listing on Craigslist. I'm looking at Philadelphia here. I'm based out of the Philadelphia area, so this is the place where I tend to normally start. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to start analyzing this, and ultimately what I want to do is plot things on a map. I guess what I want to do out of this use case is I want to say what's being posted in my neighborhood and what's the relative value of things being posted in neighborhoods that are close to my own. So what I want to do here is I'm going to take that URL and I'm going to use this forward into Power BI. So if you know anything about what the release of Power BI is all about, the four moving pieces: Power Query, Power Pivot, Power View, which I'm not going to get into too much today. I'm guessing if you're watching this video, you know what Power View is all about, and then the Power Map capability. So what I want to do here is I'm going to go into Power Query, and by the way, this add-in with the renamed and the rebranded Power Query Data Explorer is no longer part of my Excel 2013 ribbon here. That is available to you now. simply go on our site and you'll be able to find it pretty quickly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new query object inside of Power Query. And out of the chute, you'll see that it gets a pretty plain screen here for us to start with. And I'm going to traverse down through the navigator hierarchy along the left-hand side of this dialog, and it shows me the data as it is presented by the RSS feed. And some things kind of pop out to me when I take a look at this. And one of the use cases for why Power Pivot I think is important versus trying to do this in Power Pivot, it comes down to a lot of the transformations. For instance, when I take a look at the title that's coming out of the RSS feed from Craigslist, you notice what's happening here is that there's 3 different bits of information that are being kind of shoehorned into that column. First is the actual name of the item. And the second bit is a location. Location, even if you expand the rest of the columns in this feed, and one of them will be date. We don't need these other 2 bits of information here. These other table objects don't really support a lot of the analysis that I need to do in this particular use case. So I'll leave those 2 alone. But for the moment, you take a look at this title here, and I don't have a discrete column for geography. I don't have a discrete column for the price. It tends to go in this format: the title, the location, and the price. And so where Power Query is really good, and rather than having to do string manipulations and calculated columns inside of Power Pivot, I can do that sort of on the fly in this dialog. So one of the ways in which I'll transform the data that's coming in from this feed is to use a delimiter to split this column into multiples. And the first delimiter I'm going to use is a custom delimiter on the dollar figure. Now, some of the postings in Craigslist, they don't have a dollar listing. It's actually a discrete field in the way things are listed in the website. So if you were to traverse, or if you were to try to pull in an HTML dump of data here, you might be able to get to the dollar figures discretely through parsing the HTML. In this case, I can't because it's in the RSS. So I'm going to use as a dollar figure as a delimiter, and then right out of the chute, I get this column now. It's sort of a discrete way of looking at the asking price that people are demanding for their musical instruments. And what I might do here is I might call this asking price, because we know everything on Craigslist is negotiable when we're doing those kinds of transactions. So we'll also take a look at that asking price column, and we're going to change its type from something that's a text field to something that's numeric, because we are going to use this to start plotting some data points on a power map in a few moments. A couple other transformations here I want to go through. So now this first title column, it still has 2 bits of information, right? It's the item and it's the geography. And so there's a pair of transformations that I'm going to go through here to kind of strip out the city and the location where things are, where the item is parked at the moment. So I'm going to use a left open paren at the rightmost location I find it in that string, and use that to split off the description from the geography. You know, notice that the geography is not clean. In some cases, you've got cities. In some cases, you've got city-states. In some cases, you've got zip codes. In some cases, it's a little bit hairier than that. We're going to do the best that we can with the data that's coming in. Sometimes when you're doing these big data types of exercises, it's not always the cleanest chunk of stuff that you're dealing with. To simply strip out that right paren that I see throughout the occurrence of that column, I'm just going to apply another delimiter to just get that out of the mix, and then I'm just going to delete that column. So now I've got a slightly cleaner representation. And by the way that this pop-up dialog is being presented and I have access to all these functions, it's just a simple right click on the column headers that's giving me that capability. And so along the way, I'm going to call this, I'll call this city location. And we'll make sure that we include that as part of our analysis downstream when we build a map off this data. All right, so there's one other transformation against the columns that I want to look at here, and that's on the date field. So there's a stamp that comes along And you take a look at the data that's in here, and it's kind of wonky. It's like the date formatted year dash month dash day, and then on the right there's a time field, and in the middle of this thing there's a character T. It could be used as a delimiter in this case. So kind of found that out last night. So we're going to split that date time field into two. I don't really care about the time of the posting. We'll just preserve that in the data slice here in Power Query just for posterity. But we are going to focus a little bit more in this column here called date. I'm going to rename it called posting date, and perhaps we'll format this column as something that is of type time. It is important to note, in the way that the data came across as part of this RSS feed, if I had not gone through the split of the columns and had the date, the letter T, and then the time in a singular column, if I try to change that to a date and time or a date time time zone, it just errored out for me. So it made a little bit more sense to have a discrete posting date as part of my preparations of the model here in Power Query. There's a couple of things that I want to append to this data slice as well. For instance, one of the things that I may be interested in is doing a more refined way of honing in on where these items are located. And you'll find that we are looking at the Philadelphia implementation of Craigslist. And so most of these items you can probably guess are in the state of Pennsylvania for the most part. And so what we might do is we might come along into Power Query and say, I want to create a new custom column in the model. And I'm simply going to return in double quotations the literal PA for Pennsylvania. And we'll use that downstream when we start analyzing the data on a map. And you'll see that it's come along as part of a custom column. And I'm going to rename this and call this state. There's one additional bit of information that I'd like to kind of pull out of this analysis, and that is sort of the item type. Now, looking at this title column or the description column, let's look at it. Let's rename title here. We'll call this item title. And within item title, there's nothing really to tell you who was the manufacturer, how old this is, what kind of condition it's in. This becomes a big text parsing kind of exercise. One of the things that, just to simply show off how you can get started in that space, or the text analytics space in some respects, is to create, in my case, a classification column. Classification is just the word that I'm using. It's just another custom column here in Power Query. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste some logic. So Power Query has an underlying bit of logic behind it, a syntactical language that we'll use here. What do we call this? Item title. So you'll notice that there are a pair of functions here. So these are not DAX functions as you may be familiar with in Power Pivot. It's a slightly different take on things. So there's a contains function, a text.contains function. It's looking for the word amp. So I'm curious in profiling, what are amplifiers and what are things that aren't amplifiers. If you know anything about guitars, there's acoustic guitars, there's electric guitars. Electric guitars, you tend to plug into something that has a speaker that you can go and listen to it. And so I might be in the market for one of those kinds of things. So I want to do a profile and a pivot on the amps. So within the contains function, it's pretty simple. What's the field that you're looking at? What's the comparative string? And in the spirit of you don't know how the text is being formatted on the way in, I'm doing a conversion of the text in the item title field that we just created. Text.upper will convert everything in that item title field to uppercase, and so we can compare against amp, and if it's there, it's going to be a true, otherwise it's going to be a false that's returned by this contains function. When we click on OK there, you'll see a new custom field here. We're going to rename this Amplifier, if I can type correctly, Amplifier. we don't edit these videos. Hopefully you can you can ignore my typos and misclicks and whatever other challenges I present in front of myself. So now I've got the data sort of the way that I think I want downstream for my analysis. And so I have a discrete column for what's the title, what's the location, the asking price, the time period or the date this was posted, the state in which we think the item is located, as well as the condition here, whether or not it was an amplifier or not. And so once we've done that, I wanted to show you sort of the history of the transformations that have gone on from the point we got the data raw from Craigslist. We've gone through and changed some field types. We've split columns. We've created new columns. We've removed columns. We've changed column types. We've done all sorts of fun transformations. And having that sort of that history of how we took raw data and applied all sorts of ETL-like tasks upon it. It's just not something you would think you would naturally do inside of Power Pivot. If this was a truly clean and well-formatted Kimball or Inman style data mart or data warehouse we were tying to, perhaps I'd bypass Power Query altogether. But for these kinds of semi-structured data sources, this is really a lifesaver here. So what I click on when I click on the Done button, what it does, it materializes a table object inside of a worksheet in Excel, and you can see the data from left to right. It pulls back, not a huge slice of data. It is an RSS feed. It's bringing back 100 columns worth of stuff. So what I might want to do here is, if you know anything about the Philadelphia region, Philadelphia is a market that has, in the broader metro area, there are folks that live in Pennsylvania, there are folks that live in 3 surrounding counties in New Jersey, and a surrounding county in Delaware. And perhaps I want to include a couple of additional Craigslist pulls into my analysis here. Now, once again, I don't have an API to go into Craigslist and say, specify some sort of diameter given a latitude and longitude, go out and span out 50 miles and bring in all the postings. That it doesn't have that today as far as I'm aware. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to take the work that I've done so far in Philadelphia and apply it to those 2 other facets of our tri-state area. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do a duplicate. So we're going to take that Power Query dump of data from Craigslist specific to Philadelphia, and what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate it for South Jersey. So I click on that, and it brings up the same exact feed, and it dumps it into a different sheet in Excel here. What I'd like to do here is I'd like to come back into Power Query. There's a button along the right-hand side of the screen to filter and shape. It's also available to you in the ribbon. Takes you to the same spot. And what we want to do here is go back to the first step in the sequence. And in the first step of the sequence, there's the URL that started the whole chain of events downstream. And what we're going to do here is we're going to call this the South Jersey equivalent of that same feed. It's going to inspect it as XML, as you would expect. We click on OK, and when we click on OK, we get a whole bunch of different options that are coming back as part of that. And you see that the transformations at the moment, they're not there. Where's my column for the asking price? Where's the column for the geography? Well, we're only here in step 1. If we go all the way to the last step in the sequence, lo and behold, it's really there. So it's a nice way to see the right-hand side of the screen here, the steps kind of illustrate what are the changes that we have imparted upon the data source coming in. And so the city location looks as good as it's going to get for this little simpleton demo. The asking price is as good as it's going to get for now. If I scroll to the right of here, Amplifier looks like it's a good column here. State isn't, of course. And so I have to find the state where I created a new custom column and click on the gearbox. And instead of the literal PA coming along, I'm going to punch in NJ for New Jersey. and you'll see that the state has been changed. And you'll see that if I look at the last step in the sequence, it's preserving the naming of the column that I had placed upon the New Jersey literal. So when I click on done, it'll go and refresh the contents of my table in Excel there. I'm going to do one more duplication because there's also some data that I want coming out of the Delaware Craigslist feed. So going through the same process, I click on duplicate in the ribbon. I click on the filter and shape button for Power Query, and it brings me along over here. And what I might want to do at this stage of the game, same exact thing as the New Jersey conversion. Click on source. When I see the URL, I'm going to look at Delaware and no longer South Jersey. The list of objects, or the list of items for sale on Craigslist, is now totally different because we're looking at a different geography here. I'm also going to change the New Jersey literal for state to DE, standing for the state of Delaware. And that should be the third and final feed that I need for this analysis. So my work in Power Query is almost done. So you saw one set of tasks and responsibilities that I think Power Query it's necessary for. So going back to my initial sort of objection, why isn't this all in Power Pivot? Power Pivot, I think about the business-friendly modeling approach that's required to make our downstream analysis important. And it's not a Power Query versus Power Pivot thing anymore in my brain. Now I understand, at least from a transformations perspective, why having Power Query as part of the mix is so important. The second bit comes in now, which is, well, I've got these 3 discrete data feeds, but they actually represent one entity. And if I were to do a Power View report, if I were to do a map, I want to take all 3 of these things and look at them as if they're one. Now, if I were to go into Power Pivot, and by the way, along the way, this is loading all sorts of Power Query results into your Power Pivot model. So there's an intrinsic link between these things, right? If I were to take the query objects that come into Power Pivot and then go into the diagrams editor and link all these things together, it's still not going to materialize a singular representation of all Craigslist activity. I have a field in here called state, right? You'd figure that would be an attribute that I could use to delineate where did this stuff come from. But I don't want to analyze these things in 3 discrete tables in Power Pivot. I want them all as part of one. And Power Pivot really doesn't do that kind of materialized table logic at all. Usually you have to prepare the data prior to getting the Power Pivot to make all of that work. And so if I rewind here a little bit, what I want to do is I want to merge the Philadelphia, the South Jersey, and the Delaware content together. And to do that, let's go back into Power Query and let's go into the table object here. You'll see a couple of combine options here. There's a merge option here and there's an append option. The append seemed to be a little bit cleaner for this particular use case. And so let's invoke that. So from the ribbon, there's that button called append. And what I'm going to do, you see, I didn't rename the query objects here. Query 1 represents Philadelphia, and we're going to append data from query 1 parenthesis 2 close parenthesis. That this represents my South Jersey data. So that's all coming together, and you'll notice that you get this error message, or it's a warning message, I should say. Information is required about data privacy. And what this means is when you start mashing up data into a single entity from multiple sources, the owners of the data slices, they want to know that they're being credited for the data that they're providing you as part of their analysis. And so it's a warning message that Power Query provides when you're starting to do merge and I don't know about the merge side, but definitely on the append side, it gives you this selectable privacy level. And so there might be a use case where you have on-premise data which represents your stuff that's considered to be private, and you'll see that there are different switches that you can select for these privacy levels. For governance purposes, it might not be a good idea to glue your data to some data that lives out in the public domain. So this is sort of a safeguard along those lines. And so once I've gone through that process, now you're going to see a list that's got 200 items because I've got some stuff from Philadelphia represented. I have some stuff that's some items that are represented from South Jersey. Now what I might want to do is go through that same append process just one more time. So now notice what I've created here is a new Power Query object called Append1. And Append1 represents the Philadelphia data and the South Jersey data together in a single entity. And now we're going to take our Delaware data and throw that into the mix. We get the same warning, and we'll just flip this to private for now. This is public domain kind of stuff. And now I should suspect I'm going to see a table with 300 rows. If it finishes querying, it only shows me 272 rows in this particular case. But once we click out of this, we should be good. If we look at the resulting data in the Power Query object Append2, you'll see we've got 300 rows worth of data that's coming back. This represents what I want to do downstream in my visualization parts of Power BI, that being Power View, that also being Power Map. And so by clicking on this button, Load to Data Model, or that hyperlink along the right-hand side of the screen, what that's doing, it's taking Append2 and all of the logic, all of the transformation logic, all of the sourcing, all the manipulations that we've performed upon this data set, and now that's manifest in the Power Pivot model itself. I shouldn't have published that for just the Delaware data. I'm going to get rid of that for now. Don't need that. And here represents the resulting stuff that I want to start analyzing downstream in tools like Power View and Power Map. So Power Query, in order to do the visualization bits downstream, you really want this in conjunction with the Power Pivot stuff that you may already be familiar with. So in the spirit of stopping there real quick just to show you what's available, you probably know, if you're watching this video, about the availability of Power View. This has been part of the Office product since the incarnation of Office 2013. The ability for us to take that resulting data model and start building out some interesting reports and dashboards and visuals above that data. So I'm not going to spend too much time here going through the craziness that is possible when you start analyzing data in all sorts of fun ways in Power View. But long story short, if I want to take, say, a posting date and show asking price, so what's the total gross value of things that have been asked for across the known history that we have in this data set, I'm just going to simply drag those things into my Power View query, and here's a trend chart that shows me over the last week or two where we're observing some postings where the data is coming from. And I might now break that out by city location. So you'll start to see all sorts of different locations for zip code 08033, the city of Abington, which is in Montgomery County in Pennsylvania, Audubon, New Jersey. We've got all sorts of different locations that are represented here. Fairly sparse, obviously. We're not looking at a ton of data here, but you hopefully get the point. Where this gets a little bit more fun for us with this particular data set, and where we wanted to ultimately land in this example, was to do a power map. Now, as of the recording here, it's July 17th. The add-in for GeoFlow has not been rebranded as Power Map yet. It's still using the code name GeoFlow. So if you see that term, it still works in the way that you're going to see it right now. But know that it hasn't been rebranded to be consistent with Power Query as of today, at least. Also know that Power Map is not the same as some of the built-in mapping options that are available to you in Power View. So you may be familiar with some of the chart types that are native to Power View, most notably the map object, which ties into our Bing Maps engine. That is not Power Map. That's sort of a two-dimensional, let's just plot some data points on a screen and see where things reside. In this world, we are going to do a Power Map. It's available from the Insert tab of your ribbon, and lo and behold, we get sort of a simple representation of the entire US here. We're going to scroll in a little, or zoom in a little bit to see what's going on in the Delaware Valley over here, which is sort of my home base. And you'll notice that when I build out a new application in Power Map, you get this empty box over here. Now, we haven't added any layers. We haven't applied any geographic points to things. Obviously, in the Craigslist feed, I don't have sort of ideal geospatial data like lat and longitude type of things. We have the things that we've manufactured, namely the state and the city location. And the city location is not going to be perfect, but it gives us a slightly greater degree of precision over plotting some of these data points. So now when I say map it, notice what happens. Across the Delaware Valley, you start to see little red boxes appear on the screen, indicating that we've got some activity going on. And as I hover over some of these things, you'll notice it's not entirely clean. Like somewhere west of State College in Pennsylvania, there's some data point for South Jersey. You got some data for Delaware, but it's in Pennsylvania. Is that legitimate? I don't know. Probably not. But for the majority of the data points here, it's pretty clean. So these all represent legitimate cities in the state of Delaware. These represent cities along the coast of New Jersey. And we've got some data points here in Philadelphia. And even in some cases, it's bringing up neighborhood locations. So there is no such mailing address as Mount Airy, PA, that ties you to the Mount Airy neighborhood of Philadelphia. So if I can hover in on that data point once again, Mount Airy is a city elsewhere in the state, but it is also a neighborhood in Philadelphia, and that's why it's being mapped over there. So the engine is doing its best fit to see where it can plot those data points. It might not always be perfect, but it's pretty good for out of the box. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to now use the cool part of the Power Map engine, which is not just where is the data, but also show me order of magnitude. And the metric that's of most interest to us in this Craigslist analysis is to look at asking price. When I drag that into the equation, notice that you start to see some of the big bars popping up. And to give you a little bit of granularity here, there's quite a bit of a market in Wilmington right now. There's quite a bit of a market in Mount Airy. There's quite a bit of a market in, quote, South Jersey, which is a misnomer in this particular case. There's a decent market in Cherry Hill, which is about 20 minutes up the road from me. So even a roughly named geographic point here, like South Philly, it's mapped fairly accurately by the tool, which is pretty neat. All right. So with that, we have this one other attribute here, if you remember us building this out, called Amplifier. So right now, I see all the bars are red on the screen. And that's somewhat interesting, but maybe what we want to do is we want to part some sort of attribute upon the map to color code whether or not we're looking at amplifiers or not. And so what I'll do is from the query, I'm going to bring over amplifier and drag it into the box called category. And you'll see here that you start to have some green boxes popping up. So there's an amp somewhere in Mays Landing. There's an amp somewhere in Dover, Delaware. If I scroll around here a little bit, in North Wales and Montgomery County, on the main line. So you start to see a few amplifiers here popping up in various neighborhoods. So you'll find if you look at, for instance, the Chicago street crime example, there's an example of some statistics from the city of Dallas that are available when you download the currently available GeoFlow or the soon to be available Power Map add-in for Excel, you'll see these examples are available to you that have all sorts of colors going on at the same time. So it won't be, my example's not nearly as pretty, but hopefully it illustrates how quickly you can get from this to something that is a meaningful and relevant representation of the data in a visual context. Thanks for watching. Hope to see some comments from you and hope to hear from you soon. Take care.